Microphone check 1, 2. We're going to get started here shortly. We are going to have time for Q&A at the end of the talk. It's particularly important because we're recording and streaming that all the questions and answers go through a mic. So for Q&A at the end, just raise your hand and I'll carry a mic around to you if you have any questions. And I'll repeat that come Q&A time. Well, good evening and welcome to the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan's in-person and live stream broadcast of the Afghanistan Withdrawal with Mr. Adam Weinstein of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in New York City. I'm Michael Vendetten, and on behalf of my colleagues, Rachel Brooks and Erica Kubik, and the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, welcome all of you. It's still a challenge to adjust to COVID, right? And we are learning how to live stream and do our programs live all at the same time. And thanks to Class Quant and our good friends at GRCC who are helping us do that. And thanks to all of you for your patience as we work out this new situation. Council's mission is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. We do that with the help of 50 local businesses, 11 colleges and universities, one of which is Aquinas College, our host for this evening, and many other civic organizations. Together, we seek to provide programming that is credible, objective, relevant, civil, and connecting. To change the world, we believe one must first know the world. And you can learn more about what we do at worldmichigan.org. Our format for today is straightforward. We'll hear from Mr. Weinstein, and we'll have the chance to ask him questions. And you can do that, of course, here. We'll ask you to stand and state your question. And if you are watching on live stream, you can type your questions into the YouTube comments section, or you can text them to 616-308-6560. And just remember our council house rules that if you could ask your question succinctly and respectfully, that would be appreciated. Adam Weinstein is a research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. He previously worked for KPMG's international trade practice, and he assisted multinational clients in navigating Asia's changing trade landscape, incorporating human rights, due diligence into supply chains, managing sanctions risks, and utilizing free trade agreements. Adam's current research focuses on security, trade, and rule of law in Afghanistan and Pakistan. He is a member of the American Pakistan Foundation's Leadership Council and has presented at various conferences in Pakistan, which allowed him to travel throughout the country. He has been featured in Foreign Policy, and War in the Rocks, and Lawfare, The National Interest. Adam's been interviewed by all the major television networks and many national newspapers and magazines. Prior to consulting, he worked as a senior law and policy analyst at the National Iranian American Council, where he focused on the securitization of U.S. immigration policy and its effect on immigration communities. Adam received a JD from Temple University's Beasley School of Law in International Law and Transitional Justice. He also served as a U.S. Marine, and he was deployed to Afghanistan in 2012 as part of a detachment to the 2nd Air Naval Gunfire Liaison Company, where he served in Uruzgan province in support of Australia's 2nd Commando Regiment. Let's welcome Adam Weinstein to the World Affairs Council podium.
So if we really wanted to do this topic justice, I think we would have to go back and start in the 70s or the 80s or maybe even the 19th century. But I want to respect all of your time, and I'm really grateful for the council for hosting me, and we're going to start on 9/11 because I think that's all we have time for. So I'm sure all of you remember 9/11 vividly. And what I'm going to try to do is an overview in the next 20 minutes of the last 20 years of history since 9/11, which I think is a tall order, but I'm going to try to provide what I think is a relatively objective overview. And then I'll talk about why I think we faced so many challenges in Afghanistan. Now, on the day of 9/11, Pakistan's ISI security service chief was actually in Washington, D.C. And he's a very relevant person to this story because Pakistan's security agency, known as the ISI, or Inter-Services Intelligence, was one of the primary backers of the Taliban. And once the Bush administration determined that the attacks of 9/11 had been committed by al-Qaeda and they had been harbored by the Afghan Taliban, of course, the Bush administration went to the ISI chief and had a clear message to Pakistan, which was, you're either with us or against us. And so that message was communicated to the ISI chief, and then it was also communicated to the military dictator of Pakistan at the time, Pervez Musharraf. And Pervez Musharraf war-gamed the scenario and decided that possibly having to face US military action wasn't in Pakistan's interest. So of course, he would provide air and land access for the US invasion of Afghanistan. But Pakistan did this begrudgingly. They did not want to see the Taliban regime toppled, and they certainly didn't want to see a US invasion of Afghanistan. But because Musharraf was a military dictator, there was a certain expediency to working with him because you only had to go through one man. You didn't have to deal with a democratic Pakistan. Now, after the initial invasion, the Northern Alliance, which was never defeated during the Taliban's rule from 1996 to 2001, entered Kabul. Most of the al-Qaeda operatives escaped to Pakistan. Pakistan arrested some of them. And most of the Taliban's leadership escaped to Pakistan as well, and the rank and file of the Taliban disappeared into Afghanistan's thousands of villages. And the Taliban government was over relatively quickly. And so they had to address a problem, which was that they didn't have a government now. And this is where the Bonn conference happened. And various representatives of different constituencies in Afghanistan went to a conference in Bonn, Germany. And the idea was to create an interim government, which was ultimately led by Hamid Karzai, who had been living in exile in Pakistan. And that ultimately led to a new constitution, which was developed in 2004. Now, at this time, Pakistan urged the Bush administration to include the so-called moderate Taliban in this conference, and basically said, if you don't include the Taliban, they're going to come back to haunt you. But Donald Rumsfeld rejected this idea and wouldn't work with the Taliban unless it was unconditional surrender. And so the Taliban were excluded from the conference. And when we look at the different factions of the Afghan society and Afghan political class that were included in the conference, they basically agreed on nothing other than the fact that they didn't like the Taliban. Other than that, there was very little agreement on how to proceed with the new government. And so the United States needed a mediator. And interestingly, the man who ended up working with these different Afghan factions and convincing them to come to some sort of compromise was a man named Javad Zarif, who some of you may know as the past foreign minister of Iran, But at the time, he was a rising star in Iran's foreign ministry. So it was actually Zarif who was able to communicate with all of these different Afghans and convince them to form an interim government. Now, I'm sure most of you know at that time, US-Iranian relations were pretty bad, probably not as bad as they are today, but they certainly weren't good. But Iran was no friend of the Taliban, and in fact, Iran had even considered a ground invasion of Afghanistan, and there were very contentious relations with the Taliban because the Taliban had killed Iranian diplomats in Mazar-e-Sharif. Ultimately, Iran chose not to invade Afghanistan. But Iran was more than happy to see the Taliban go. And so Iranian intelligence actually offered the CIA a fair bit of intelligence in the early days of the invasion, and the foreign ministry offered their diplomatic services when it came to working with the Afghans. But this brief period of cooperation between Iran and the United States came to a grinding halt because of a speech that I'm sure most of you remember, which was President Bush's Axis of Evil speech, in which he included Iraq, Iran, and North Korea in his so-called Axis of Evil, and Iranian cooperation, of course, ended after that. Now, in the early years after the US invasion, Afghanistan was pretty calm. It faded from the news headlines. There wasn't much fighting. The Taliban were basically non-existent. And of course, we became distracted as a country by the war in Iraq, and that's where the focus shifted. Now, the United States military was still operating in Afghanistan at this time, and they were trying to extend the writ of the new Afghan government. And the way they did this was by partnering with local warlords and local power brokers on the ground. The problem is that some of these former warlords and power brokers took the United States for a ride, so to speak, and would convince the US military to either arrest or kill personal enemies by saying they were al-Qaeda members or they were Taliban members, when in fact it was just a local feud. And over time, this bred a lot of resentment in the rural areas of Afghanistan, and the Taliban actually used this resentment to make inroads, of course, also with the help of Pakistan. And this period in Afghanistan, I think, could be defined as one of exponential growth in the cities, but rampant corruption at the same time. And in the rural countryside, there were significant abuses that were occurring. And so by the time President Obama took office, the Taliban had once again gained a foothold in Afghanistan, and they were again a formidable force to be contended with. And so President Obama announced his famous surge, and this surge would have upwards of 100,000 boots on the ground at any given point. I deployed to Afghanistan in 2012, which was at the tail end of the surge when we were starting to send people home, although I was in the southwest of the country where the fight was still very kinetic. But the height of the surge was between 2009 and 2011. And the surge followed a classic counterinsurgency model. The idea was to clear territory and then hold it. So the US military was pretty good at clearing territory and getting the Taliban out of areas. But the Afghan military was terrible at holding this territory. So what we had was basically a constellation of these small combat outposts and forward operating bases that would basically be orbiting larger bases. It was like this little solar system of US control in the rural areas. But a lot of times, the control we had over an area didn't really extend much further beyond the outpost. And that was particularly true for the Afghan military. And the Afghan military simply wasn't capable of conducting missions on their own without the hand-holding of US Marines or the US Army, with the exception of the commando units, which were the special forces of the Afghan military who were quite competent, but there were very few of them. And so the surge ends around 2011, 2012, and by 2014, technically, it becomes a NATO-led mission rather than a US-led mission, although in reality, it's still very much a US-led mission. And it also becomes a train and advise mission rather than a combat mission, but in reality, it's still very much a mission in which US troops are involved in combat. And during this time, the United States begins to rely more heavily on airstrikes rather than ground troops because they couldn't justify having as many troops on the ground. So in order to make up for that, they had to lean more heavily on air support. And in 2015, partly because US troops had lowered, the number of US troops had become diminished, the Taliban were able to take a major city, which was Kunduz, and that was in the north of the country. And they were able to hold Kunduz for 2 weeks. And it actually took US airstrikes and ultimately US boots on the ground to retake Kunduz from the Taliban because the Afghan security forces were simply not able to do it on their own. But during that effort, the United States actually bombed a Doctors Without Borders hospital and killed 42 people. So there was a significant cost to these airstrikes. And actually, a lot of folks might not know this, but in 2019, more airstrikes were conducted in Afghanistan than in any of the years prior. And the rules of engagement became particularly loose during the Trump administration, partly because of the experience the United States had against ISIS. So when the United States tried to clear ISIS out of Mosul in Iraq, they loosened the rules of engagement because they were essentially fighting a war of attrition. They weren't fighting a counterterrorism mission. They weren't fighting a counterinsurgency. They were trying to kill as many ISIS members as possible. So in Iraq, for example, you would have rules of engagement where if there were several cars around a compound, they might just blow up the entire compound because there were so many vehicle-borne IEDs, or essentially car bombs, that they saw that as enough evidence of ISIS activity that they might blow up a compound. So what happened was these sort of loose rules of engagement that were designed for Iraq against ISIS were transitioned over into Afghanistan. The problem with that was it's a very different kind of battle space. And so in 2018, 2019, the rules of engagement were so loose that if someone was walking around with a handheld radio, that might justify a drone strike. But the problem with that is that the Taliban had taken out of a lot of the cell towers in southwestern Afghanistan to try to prevent government communications. So even local civilians who weren't connected with the Taliban at all were walking around with these two-way radios. So it ended up translating into a lot of civilian casualties. And if any of you have more interest in that, you can read some of the reporting of Jack Murphy, who served in the Ranger Battalion, but then became an investigative journalist and looked into some of the air wars. And another investigative journalist who looked into these airstrikes is a woman by the name of Azmat Khan, who's at Columbia University's journalism school now, if any of you want to search those names. So after the Trump administration took office, they began the negotiations that occurred in Doha that ultimately produced the US-Taliban agreement that negotiated our withdrawal from the country. And the idea of these negotiations was to attempt to achieve a political settlement to the war, but the main objective was to get US troops out of the country because the Trump administration had determined, I think, that it wasn't in the US interests to stay in Afghanistan indefinitely. And so a man named Mullah Baradar was released from Pakistani prison in 2018 at the request of the Trump administration. And he had been arrested 8 years earlier in 2010 by the Pakistanis. And the reason the Pakistanis arrested Mullah Baradar actually had very little to do with trying to fight the Taliban. Mullah Baradar was a more pragmatic Taliban leader, and he had actually tried to engage in backdoor negotiations with the Afghan government, and the Pakistanis had found out about it, and they weren't very pleased with it because they thought at the time, because of the surge, the United States and the Afghan government had too much leverage, and any political settlement that would be achieved wouldn't be helpful to Pakistan and probably not to the Taliban either. So because Mullah Baradar was actually pragmatic and tried to engage in diplomacy, he had been arrested by the Pakistanis and he served 8 years in Pakistani prison. And in 2018, he was released, and he ended up going to Doha, where the Taliban had a political office, and he led negotiations between the Taliban and the United States. Now, the agreement is between the Taliban and the United States because the Afghan government was not part of the negotiating process. And I think this is because the Trump administration determined that the Taliban had a military advantage and that if they included the Afghan government in negotiations from the beginning, they would never actually get a deal. And what they were really interested in was a deal that would allow the United States to leave Afghanistan, so they had to cut the Afghan government out of these negotiations. And if you look at the agreement, it's a little bit skewed in favor of the Taliban, and that's probably because the Taliban had a military advantage. If you look at the specific things that the agreement requires, it's very clear what the United States has to do. The United States has to reduce its troop levels. The United States has to ultimately leave by May 1st, 2021. And when you look at what the Taliban have to do, it's a lot more ambiguous. They have to ensure that non-state actors don't engage in attack against the US or its allies. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean they have to kick al-Qaeda out of the country? Does that mean they have to break ties with al-Qaeda? Does that mean they have to actively try to disrupt al-Qaeda? Nobody really knows. They also had to engage in talks with the Afghan government, but they didn't necessarily have to substantively engage. The intention was that the talks would reach a political settlement, but it wasn't really a requirement for the withdrawal. And so I guess I would summarize the agreement as don't shoot us on the way out and at least sit down with the Afghan government. But what the agreement did achieve was we had over 1 year without a US casualty, which was huge. It's something that hadn't been achieved before. Now, after the US-Taliban agreement was signed in February of 2020, talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government were supposed to start right away. They were supposed to start in March, but they were delayed. And they were delayed for two reasons. One was the ambiguity of the agreement. For example, the agreement has a clause that says the Afghan government has to release up to 5,000 prisoners. Well, the Taliban interpreted that as no less than 5,000 prisoners, and of course, the Afghan government had a very different interpretation because they weren't in a rush to release 5,000 fighters back onto the battlefield. So there were delays in the prisoner releases. And another issue that took place was the 2019 presidential elections in Afghanistan were disputed. In fact, Abdullah Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani held competing inaugurations on the same day. And Abdullah Abdullah was really hoping that the United States would attend his inauguration. Instead, the US Embassy chose to attend no inauguration. And ultimately, the Trump administration had to threaten to hold $1 billion in aid in order for the Afghan government to get its act together, and Ashraf Ghani became president, and Abdullah Abdullah became more involved in the negotiation process. So as a result of all of those delays, the negotiations between the Afghan government and the Taliban started 6 months late, and that was really precious time that was wasted. And so they started in September of 2020 rather than March of 2020. And the talks went sort of hobbled along from September to October to November. And by December, the only thing they had really achieved was they agreed on what the rules were to talk about the actual issues. They hadn't agreed on anything substantive after 3 months. And then they took a recess. And the talks never really resumed in earnest after that. And actually, your Representative Meyer gave an interesting interview to Fox News in April, well after the talks had stalled, and basically made the assessment that even the presence of US troops prevented a political settlement from happening because the presence of US troops was altering the power dynamics in what was essentially a civil war. And I agree with Rep. Meyer's statements there. So during this time, as these talks are stalling, President Biden assumed office and started a review process over whether he would essentially go through with the agreement that President Trump had negotiated and withdraw. And so that review process took several months. Now, President Biden, for political reasons, I think, has said that the administration's hands were tied due to the agreement that Trump had negotiated. And I think there's some truth to that, because by negotiating an agreement with the Taliban that ultimately was about the withdrawal of U.S. troops, we went 1 year without U.S. casualties and we lowered our troop levels. But if President Biden had abrogated the deal that President Trump negotiated, then the Taliban would have re-engaged with U.S. troops and we would have likely had to raise the troop levels again. But I don't think that's the reason that President Biden ultimately went through with the withdrawal. I think President Biden, if you look at the history of his statements, even as vice president, he was critical of the surge. He was always critical of the war in Afghanistan. And he had some resentment towards the Pentagon for not listening to him when he was vice president. And I think he really did want to get out of Afghanistan. And so President Biden ultimately determined to go through with the withdrawal, and the first date he announced was September 11th, and then he adjusted it to August 31st because the withdrawal was going faster than expected. And that gets us to the evacuation, and of course, I think it goes without saying that the evacuation was sloppy, and some of that was because the United States simply didn't think that Kabul would fall as quickly as it did. And once it did fall, it became a rather chaotic evacuation. And according to the Department of Homeland Security, of the more than 60,000 people who were evacuated from Kabul during that evacuation, only 3% were the Afghan special immigrant visa applicants who were the people who were supposed to be evacuated in the first place. It became sort of a mad rush to the airport, and whoever got there first got out, and whoever had political connections also got out. And so there's still a process underway to try to get the special immigrant visa applicants, most of whom are former interpreters, out. And there's still some flights that are going out and land routes into Pakistan and Uzbekistan and other countries, but that's an effort that's still ongoing. Now, I want to transition to what I think are the causes of our loss of the war in Afghanistan, and I'm personally characterizing it as a loss. Number one was mission creep. When we entered Afghanistan in 2001, it was a very limited mission. The mission was to dismantle al-Qaeda. And we did dismantle al-Qaeda, but we didn't defeat al-Qaeda. And those are two very different things. The problem is, after we dismantled al-Qaeda, because the Bush administration refused to engage with the Taliban to achieve any kind of agreement with them, we had to fight a counterinsurgency. And to fight a counterinsurgency, we had to engage in nation building. Because there was no government, there was no military. We had to build up a military. We had to build up a government. So over time, a mission that had started as a very narrow mission to fight al-Qaeda became a massive mission to build schools, to help run elections, to help, everything down to making sure that there was drinking water. And this was a mission that I don't think the United States was prepared to invest in to the extent that it would have needed to even have a chance of achieving it. Another reason for our failure in Afghanistan was conflicting short-term U.S. foreign policy goals. I've already talked about Iran. The fact that we had a partner at the beginning with the Iranian government, even though we disagreed with them on every other issue, we had a common enemy, and as they say, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But it was more important to the Bush administration to isolate Iran at that time than to work with them to try to stabilize Afghanistan. And so over time, the Iranians began to support the Taliban. They began to train some of their fighters in Mashhad, which is a city in Iran, and those became some of the best trained fighters the Taliban had. They also began to fund them as well. And the idea from the Iranian perspective wasn't that they wanted to see the Taliban take over Afghanistan, they just wanted to poke at the United States, because why not? And so another example of a conflicting short-term US foreign policy goal was the helicopters we provided the Afghan military. And I like to use this example because it's a perfect illustration of how at every juncture, when Afghanistan was weighed against another foreign policy goal, Afghanistan lost. And so when we initially entered Afghanistan and we tried to train an Afghan Air Force, we provided them with Mi-17 helicopters. And these were Soviet-era helicopters that were specifically designed for the climate and terrain of Afghanistan. And they were relatively simple to maintain and relatively simple to fly as compared to the US Black Hawks. In fact, the US Black Hawks are so complex to maintain that the US military doesn't even maintain them. They use contractors. We use contractors to maintain our Black Hawks because it's simply not cost effective to train our own military to maintain them. And so over time, actually beginning around, I think 2014, we began to transition the Afghan Air Force to Black Hawks instead of Mi-17s. And you might ask yourself, why would we give this nascent Air Force a helicopter that's more complex to maintain? They can't do it on their own, and it's more complex to fly. Well, when Russia invaded Crimea, and also due to the alleged interference in the 2016 election, Congress had no stomach or no incentive to be using US taxpayer money to pay for Russian-made helicopters. So essentially, US Congress wanted to punish Russia for its actions in Crimea and its actions during the 2016 election. And one of the ways to do that was to stop paying for the parts for these helicopters or paying for new helicopters and transition Afghanistan's military to American-made Black Hawks. So it's a small example, but it's an example of how Afghanistan was always a low priority when you look at the competing array of US foreign policy objectives. Another reason that I think we failed in Afghanistan is building a partner force is just very difficult. You know, I remember I was tasked at one point with trying to teach the Afghan provincial police how to use radios. Well, it's hard to teach people how to use radio frequencies when they don't know arithmetic. We had these laminated cards that showed the different parts of the radio and labeled them in Pashto and Dari. Well, they couldn't read Pashto or Dari. They couldn't read their native language. So the card was of no use. And so that's an example of how the US military was being given a task that it really wasn't designed for. US Marines were not designed to be teachers of basic arithmetic. And that's what was being asked of us in terms of trying to create this fighting force. Now, there were exceptions. The Green Berets worked with the more elite units, and I think they were very good about training them and creating a competent force, but they would go on these 3-month deployments and they would work with their Afghan counterparts for years on end, and so they developed personal relationships. But that wasn't true for the average US soldier or US Marine who was working with the Afghan military. And there were also, I think, cultural differences that made training the Afghan military very difficult. Anyone who's ever served in the US Marine Corps knows that the Marine Corps style of training is break you down and build you back up. Well, that didn't work very well with Pashtun culture, and I think it bred a lot of resentment among Afghan soldiers for the Marines who were training with them because it just wasn't acceptable to use the kind of harsh style that the Marine Corps prides itself on for training. Another issue, and perhaps maybe one of the most important issues, was the lack of legitimacy in the Afghan government that was exploited by the Taliban. Now, this shouldn't be conflated with the idea that Afghans support the Taliban. In fact, I think the majority of Afghans, even in the most conservative parts of the country, preferred the idea of a republic. But they didn't like the republic as it was. They didn't like the corrupt leadership that had existed under the Karzai government and then again under the Ghani administration. And so this lack of legitimacy in Kabul was exploited by the Taliban, and they were able to gain support in many of the rural areas. And more importantly, when they took over the country in August, the Afghan military simply wasn't willing to engage in an existential fight to preserve the republic, precisely because I think they weren't willing to die for the Ghani administration, and they knew that the political elites in Kabul would ultimately flee the country, which they did. And lastly, I think there was the reality that we would leave, and everybody factored this reality into their calculation in Afghanistan. Because the Afghan government presumed that the United States would leave one day, this incentivized corruption. Why not be corrupt and create a plan B for yourself in Dubai or Turkey if you think that the United States will leave and ultimately your government will collapse? It factored into Pakistan's calculation. Why not support the Afghan Taliban when you assume the United States will leave and the Taliban will take over the country and you don't necessarily want to have poor relations with the future government of your neighbor? And of course, it factored into the Taliban's calculation. I think they had incredible resolve to fight. And of course, there was no plan B for the Taliban. There was only a plan A, and that was Afghanistan. For the last section of this talk, before we move to the Q&A, I want to raise some questions that I think we should be asking ourselves as a country. And the first question is, could we have done things differently by staying? In other words, was this a sustainable effort? And I've seen a lot of arguments come out of Washington, D.C. that says, well, they say we could have just kept 2,500 troops in the country. And we could have just kept using airstrikes, and we could have kept the government intact. That's true, but at what cost? I already used the example in 2015 when we bombed a Doctors Without Borders hospital. We saw this latest strike during the evacuation that killed 10 people and 7 children. And this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what the civilian cost of airstrikes was in Afghanistan. What about Afghan casualties? In 2020, the Afghan military lost 10,000 people, 10,000 fatalities, not just casualties, fatalities. In 2019, they lost 10,000 people. In 2018, they lost 7,000 to 9,000 people. In 2017, they lost 7,000 to 9,000 people. And each of those years, on average, the civilian death rate was around 1,500. So when people talk about the war being sustainable, what they're really saying is, well, yeah, we could have kept it going and see what happens. The only cost would have been 12,000 plus Afghans per year. Now, when we look at what was the US cost, total deaths were 2,461. Wounded in action was 20,753. Of those wounded in action, I think something like 800 were major limb amputees. So people losing legs and arms, people whose lives will never be normal again. Now, it is true that in the last several years, because of the heightened airstrikes and having less boots on the ground, we had less death. In 2020, we had 11 deaths, 14 wounded in action. In 2019, we had 23 deaths on 192 wounded in action. But what I'd ask of all of you is when you answer this question for yourselves, let's just be honest about what continuing the war effort would have meant. It would have meant 20 to 40 billion US dollars per year and a dozen to 24 US deaths per year and probably around 10,000 Afghan military deaths per year. And so that's what the true cost would have been. And then I guess the last question I would ask is why is it so hard to end a war compared to beginning one in this country? And I think the reasons for that are these open-ended authorizations for use of military force that at this stage are now 20 years old. And there's just a complete lack of congressional oversight. And what this has led to is it's incentivized Congress to essentially abdicate its responsibility of oversight and instead engage in opportunism. And this exists on both sides of the aisle. Why have a clear position on Afghanistan when you can just go whichever way the wind blows and both criticize staying and also criticize the withdrawal? And with that, I think I'd like to transition to the Q&A.
Let's thank Adam for getting us started today. Thank you. Thank you. So many things to talk about. And I just want to remind those who are watching remotely that you can text 616-308-6560 or put your question in the YouTube comments section, and Erica will get to them and we'll get to your questions. Those of you here, our friend Mark from Aquinas will hand you the microphone if you want to raise your hand and ask a question. And I'll just get things started. I got a question already from remotely about Pakistan. Are they friend, are they foe, or are they both?
I think Pakistan is neither friend nor foe. Look, the United States has a few allies in this world, but for the most part, what we have is countries that temporarily have some overlapping strategic interests with us. Now, even the biggest critics of Pakistan will admit that the ISI was helpful in targeting al-Qaeda. And they'll probably continue to be helpful targeting al-Qaeda because Pakistan has no interest in seeing al-Qaeda have a footprint in the region. But Pakistan was never going to be helpful with the Afghan Taliban because its fundamental strategic calculations were different. It didn't want to see an Afghanistan that was closely aligned with India, and the Northern Alliance that we empowered after we invaded was close with India. So it's difficult to have cooperation from Pakistan when we've just kicked out the Taliban and elevated a group like the Northern Alliance that has close relationships, a close relationship with Pakistan's arch rival. So that's one of the issues. And another issue with Pakistan was I think Pakistan has always been worried about a very stable or strong Afghan state because the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Durand Line, is a disputed border to some degree because some Pashtun nationalists think that the border of Afghanistan should extend beyond the Durand Line and include the Pashtun areas in northern Pakistan. And so I think Pakistan has always preferred an Afghanistan that was either unstable or governed by a group that it had good relations with so that that border wouldn't be disputed. So going forward with Pakistan, I think we have to just accept that there will be certain areas where we have overlapping interests and there will be many areas where we don't. And I'd say that dividing the world between friends and foes or democracies and non-democracies is not a productive way to engage in foreign relations because it's rarely that black and white.
Hi. Before I ask this question, I want to thank you for you fulfilling what you felt was your duty in serving on behalf of all of us who are here. I'm very grateful for that. In your analysis of the various things which led up to our failure, I was wondering where you think failure of military leaders to provide an accurate estimation of Afghanistan's capacity to hold the line at some point. Because it feels like we kept being fed this notion that, they can hold the line here, and everything we were told didn't come true. I understand, from the example you gave, how difficult it must be to try to train a military population like you were trying to train. You were aware of it, and that did not apparently make it to the point where whoever's communicating to higher levels believed that things were going to go south as quickly as they went south.
Well, thanks for your words, first of all. I think Quincy Institute actually had a Q&A with Craig Whitlock, who published the Afghanistan papers, and he has a new book out. So I encourage you to read the book. I also encourage you to go to Quincy Institute's website, the events page, and you can find the Q&A that I did with Craig Whitlock. And that's about an hour, so if you want kind of an abridged version of the book, I think that's a good place to start. There's no doubt that the generals were lying to the public, and of course, you don't become a general by giving too much bad news, and you don't become a general by saying, "Sir, I don't think we can do that." And so I think there is a culture in the Pentagon that wants to succeed, and they want to produce results, and they don't want to say, no, we can't do that, and they want to be utilized, and they want a bigger budget. Like any organization, it wants to survive, and it thinks the only way to survive is to keep growing. They certainly don't want to be underutilized. And in some ways, I think the only reason that the Pentagon is swallowing the bitter pill of withdrawing from Afghanistan, because they certainly didn't want to leave, is because now they think, well, we can focus more on China. So I don't think many folks at the Pentagon believe in a more restrained US foreign policy. But at the end of the day, it's the civilian leadership that's responsible. It's why I don't like the phrase, Biden overruled the generals. Biden can't overrule the generals. The generals report to the commander-in-chief. That's the way this country works. And so ultimately, I hold the Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations all responsible for allowing the military to have too much of a say in policy. And it was their job to veto and to say no, and to hold military leadership accountable when they were clearly misleading the public and lawmakers and frankly the White House about what kind of progress was being made on the ground. And by the way, we can start doing that by rescinding the AUMFs and not having a blank check on authorization of use of military force. Because what that does is it really burdens the president. If you have all of these tools at your disposal and you choose not to use them, that's a politically very costly action for a president to take. We've already seen the blowback that Biden got for the withdrawal, and I think the Trump administration would have gotten the same blowback. And so I think presidents would actually be happy to have a more narrow authorization so that they weren't burdened by it.
Again, thanks for your service. With the Taliban in charge now, where do you see our relationship with Afghanistan 1 year down the road and 5 years down the road?
Well, I always say that people make predictions about Afghanistan and God laughs. And I think most predictions have been wrong, and including some of my own predictions have been wrong. For example, I didn't think that the Afghan government would collapse so rapidly. I thought we'd see more of a civil war reminiscent of the 1990s. So my prediction there was wrong too. So take what I have to say with a grain of salt. But I think that the Biden administration is not going to formally recognize the Afghan government for a multitude of reasons. One, I think it would be political suicide. Two is that the Afghan government includes members of the Haqqani network, which are listed as a foreign terrorist organization or an FTO. So I don't even know that they could recognize the government. And they're probably going to try to use that as a carrot to have some sort of leverage. But the terminology that Secretary of State Blinken used the other day was they're the de facto government. So I think that's how we're going to treat them. They're the de facto government. There's going to be some relations. But I think this is a critical test for the United States. Are we going to disengage diplomatically simply because we don't have boots on the ground? There has to be a middle ground between having 100,000 troops on the ground versus having no diplomatic presence whatsoever. And I think what the last 20 years has produced is this sort of diplomatic engagement where if we're not involved in a combat role, we don't care about what happens to the country. And we made that same mistake in the 90s. We were deeply involved in the anti-Soviet war in the 1980s, then we completely disengaged in the 1990s, and that's how 9/11 happened. And I think it would be a mistake to do that again. And it would be a mistake to cut off aid or try to, I think, essentially asphyxiate the country just to deal with the Taliban while forgetting that there's still 40 million innocent people there. So the Biden administration has its work cut out for it. It's going to have to try to find a way to continue humanitarian aid, continue to try to invest in Afghan people, but at the same time ensure that that aid isn't used by the Taliban in a nefarious way. And that's going to involve cooperation with regional countries, and they're really going to have to walk a tightrope, and hopefully they're capable of doing that. But I could also see it going in a direction where we just have no relations with the Afghan government and we completely disengage, or perhaps we become militarily involved again if we determine there's a terrorist threat, just as we did in Iraq. So I think it could go the wrong direction very easily.
In regard to the AUMF, I know Obama changed it a little bit, and then I believe Peter Meyer has put a bill in Congress to rescind that, from Congress having no role anymore in that and rescinding the AUMF. But I haven't been paying a ton of attention. But do you think that there would be any chance that Congress might revoke the AUMF, from being in the president's purview?
Well, I hope so. I think there's increasing pressure in Congress, and President Biden himself has said that he wants to see a more limited AUMFs. I think in order to change the way we engage in intervention, we'll have to also accept the losses of Iraq and Afghanistan and have a real honest conversation. Because if what we were to do was rescind the AUMFs and we still have troops in Iraq, for example, I think that mission would just be grandfathered into whatever the next authorization is. So I think we have to have a real honest conversation as a country about our own limitations when it comes to intervention, and also rescind the AUMFs.
I have a friend who was not happy with Biden setting a date for their withdrawal. And what she said was he should have set it much later, like in the fall or winter, when the Taliban normally doesn't fight. I'm just curious what you think about that.
I always thought the May date was a little bit odd because summer is the fighting season. And if you wanted to give the Afghan government and military a fighting chance of succeeding without US support, why would you leave right at the beginning of the fiercest fighting? Now, that date was chosen by the Trump administration. I don't know why they chose that date. Maybe it's the date they could get. I think we have to remember that when the Trump administration began negotiating with the Taliban, we were losing the war. People act like we weren't losing the war because it wasn't in the headlines. The Taliban was slowly gaining more ground, year by year, month by month. And the Afghan security forces were no closer to being able to stand on their own 2 feet than they were when they collapsed. So I think we got the agreement we could get. Now, if I wanted to criticize the Trump administration in terms of how it negotiated the agreement, I could say that the sequencing of things was off, and that maybe they could have negotiated a little bit harder. Maybe they could have insisted that the Afghan government was in the room. Maybe they could have, at one point Trump made an announcement about withdrawing troops by Christmas that was supposedly intended to exert some leverage over the Ghani administration to actually negotiate it. But what it really ended up doing was derailing the talks by inserting a bunch of uncertainty into when the US would leave. I could nitpick what the Trump administration did, but at the end of the day, I think we got an agreement that was lopsided because the battlefield was lopsided. And so the agreement reflected the conditions on the ground. There's plenty of problems with that agreement, but there was also plenty of problems with the way we were conducting the war. Now, had the Biden administration chosen to extend into winter, the Taliban would have started fighting the United States again, and we would have had to increase troop numbers. And I guess the question I would ask everyone in this room is, if your son or daughter came back either dead or without legs, would you think that was a worthy sacrifice for a small chance that maybe the Afghan government would survive? Because that's what we're talking about.
Thank you for coming here to talk with us about Afghanistan. I have two quick questions. Would Afghanistan become a host of radicals from everywhere again, just like what happened in 90s? The other question is, now Afghanistan become the only Sunni conservative country after Saudi Arabia being changed. So do you think, is there any threat from Afghanistan to Saudi Arabia? Is there any danger from Afghanistan and Taliban to Saudi Arabia or not after the divorce during 90s between Taliban and Saudi regime?
I think Saudi Arabia has always been worried about successful Islamist groups. Of course, I think they're most paranoid about the Muslim Brotherhood because they see that as a threat to their legitimacy. And they're a little bit less worried about the Taliban. But, I mean, it goes without question that, look, from the Taliban's perspective, they just defeated a superpower. And to some degree, that's true, but it was a self-inflicted defeat on our part. And I think, of course, that's going to be used as propaganda, and that's going to inspire certain extremist Islamist groups. But then that reality exists across the world, and we can't possibly occupy every country where that threat exists indefinitely. And I think it also becomes a question of priorities, in my view. I mean, think about the money that was spent on Afghanistan. Whether you think that money should have been spent building schools or should have been tax breaks to the American public, wherever you fall on the spectrum, that was $2 trillion that was taken from the American public, and what did it really accomplish in the grand scheme of things? And in terms of threats, well, I mean, whatever threats you prioritize, whether it's COVID, whether it's gun violence, whether it's things with the climate, whether it's infrastructure, whatever threat you think faces the United States, all of those threats are actually greater in quantity than the threat of terrorism at this point. So I think it's not that terrorism is not a threat. It becomes, where do you prioritize it in all these threats we're facing as a country? And so I do think there's a risk that Afghanistan will become a hotbed of extremism. Even if the Taliban wanted to control al-Qaeda, which they clearly don't because they still have a relationship with al-Qaeda, but even if they wanted to enforce, take enforcement action against al-Qaeda, I don't think they could. Even the Afghan government and the United States military wasn't capable of completely destroying al-Qaeda. So why would the Taliban be capable of that? So of course that threat's going to continue, and it's a threat that China faces, Russia faces, Pakistan faces. I mean, every single week, Pakistani soldiers are killed by the TTP, which is the Pakistani Taliban. So these groups threaten the region and the United States, although I think al-Qaeda is particularly focused on the United States. So I think it's a threat we have to be cognizant of. In one of his speeches, President Biden said that al-Qaeda was defeated. I don't agree with that. That's president speak. The reality is it was degraded. It wasn't defeated. But it comes down to priorities, in my view, because the threat of terrorism emanates from many more countries beyond just Afghanistan.
Hi, we've got a text question kind of going back to an earlier conversation. A listener wanted to maybe have a little bit more information on the process for rescinding the AUMF, and maybe if I can add to that, is there something a U.S. citizen could do if that was something they would be in support of to help Congress people make that happen?
I mean, it's really simple. Contact your local representative, whether it be a senator or a congressperson, and ask them to support an advanced legislation to rescind the AUMFs. And you can do that via email. You can do that by calling them. Congressional offices really do track the calls they receive. Even if you call and the person you talk to is clearly a college intern, which is probably what it's going to be, they still log that, and they look at volume. And so they really do care. Write a letter to the editor in your local newspaper. Congressional offices even if nobody else reads letters to editors, congressional offices actually do read letters to the editor in the newspapers within their districts. That's a really powerful tool. It's 100 words. Anyone can write 100 words. So if you like writing, write op-eds. I mean, there's ways to get your point across, and lawmakers do listen when you do that. And you can always use Twitter as well, but I think that's the lowest lift. I actually think it's better to just call the offices and email them and write letters and things like that.
Can you clarify what that legislation is that you want rescinded?
Well, it would be legislation to rescind the original AUMF. So it would be legislation.
That's what I don't understand. You keep saying it fast, and I don't know what that is. IMF?
Oh, AUMF is an authorization for use of military force. So there was.
MF, authorization, use military force, use military force. Okay, great, that's what I didn't
Yeah,
understand.
there's different AUMFs. There was one for the Iraq War, there was one for 9/11, there's been AUMFs prior to that. And so, but they've become expansive. They've essentially just grandfathered any conflict. And so you might use an AUMF that was originally intended to fight Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to justify a strike in Somalia, because they'll say, well, that's an extension of the war on terror, so the same AUMF applies.
We know that the Taliban or the Afghan government left over a lunch break, basically. Are they a government in exile, or have they just taken off to their bank accounts, or what's happening with them? Where are they?
Well, Ashraf Ghani is in Dubai, as far as I know. What's interesting is that different parts of the government went to different places. The NDS, which is like the CIA of Afghanistan, most of them went to Turkey for some reason. I think because they had connections there. Most of Ashraf Ghani's cabinet went to Dubai. Amrullah Saleh, who was the vice president, is supposedly in Tajikistan. He went, after, to Amrullah Saleh's credit, after Ghani fled, he actually went to the Panjshir Valley or supposedly went to the Panjshir Valley, although that's pretty unclear, and continued fighting. But he's supposedly in Tajikistan now. Some of the warlords who were part of the government are now in Uzbekistan. So everybody's run away to different places, and some of them are corrupt and some of them aren't. And the lower level government officials are probably in hiding in Afghanistan somewhere.
Appreciate all the things you've told us about the different players in government who bear responsibility for what has happened. I have two questions. One is, what about the role of business and the amount of money that found its way into U.S. and multinational corporations, as opposed to maybe really staying in Afghanistan? And the other question is about the militarization of Afghanistan and just the spread of weapons. And I think we see in our own country that there's lots of weapons, and what happens in a society when it breaks down and people have so many guns and other ways of destroying human life.
Yeah, well, I mean, the spread of weapons into Afghanistan and Pakistan goes back decades, and it's because the United States, Russia, and other regional countries have supported proxies and flooded the country with weapons. And so that's something that's just not going to go away at this point. In terms of the responsibility that corporations bear, and I guess I would specifically point to defense contractors, I think there is a responsibility there. Look, the amount of money that went into Afghanistan built plenty of mansions in Dubai for Afghan elites, and it built plenty of mansions in Northern Virginia as well. And that's a reality. And one of my colleagues named Eli Clifton actually wrote an article that you can find it's called Responsible Statecraft, the publication. He looked into the amount of financial connections that advisors to the congressionally mandated Afghanistan study group had with defense contractors. And some of them were on the board of defense contractors or had been paid by defense contractors, and yet these are the people advising Congress and ultimately the president on whether we should stay or go. And some folks in Washington will say, well, don't say that. It's just a coincidence that they happen to be paid $40,000 or whatever amount of money, or $100,000, but they also think that we should continue to have a footprint in these countries and that people can separate these conflicting interests. But I don't think we would, as a country, I don't think we would tolerate that kind of conflict of interest in any other area of American life. But for some reason, when it comes to defense, we do that. And of course, there's a pipeline for senior military officers into the defense contractors as well. And why are defense contractors, they have incredible lobbying power in Congress. And I don't know that the American public realizes just how much sway defense contractors have. I forget which one, but one of the defense contractors is a sponsor of Politico magazine. Isn't that bizarre?
So you had mentioned about the soldiers and how parents might not want their children coming back with no legs or no arms. I served over in Afghanistan and was a nurse and took care of those that were, coming in mutilated, being sent home. So my first question is, what would you say to somebody that is that combat vet that lost his legs or his arms with regard to what you're talking about tonight? And the second is, I've had a lot of people approach me and ask me what my opinion was at the time when I was serving, and as a military officer, my opinion was I couldn't really have a personal opinion. I was wearing the uniform. So those of us who raised our right hand, we support and defend our Constitution no matter where we are sent. And so far as children or parents coming to me saying, should I let my child join the military, if we don't have folks standing up and saying, yes, I want to support and defend, things like this would continue. So how do you kind of reply to that with regard to what you just said with saying, how would you feel if it was your child? Because if it's not your child, it's somebody's that's going. So I'm a little perplexed by that.
Well, Americans have to care more about their neighbors, but unfortunately, I don't know that that's true in the United States today. What is it, less than 1% of the country serves in the military. And if the military were more diverse politically and socioeconomically, I think we'd have a more healthy national defense policy. And it is pretty diverse, but it could be more diverse. I think in terms of the sacrifice people make, and look, I don't represent all veterans. I'm one veteran, plenty of vets made bigger sacrifices than me. And there's veterans who I respect and love who think we should stay in Afghanistan and who think I'm crazy for saying that I support the withdrawal. Although I do think if you look at the numbers, the majority of veterans supported the withdrawal. But it's a slight majority, it's not an overwhelming majority. I think most veterans would agree with this though. When you serve the country, you don't serve the mission. Missions come and go. I think Vietnam vets were pretty conflicted about that war as well. Not every conflict we're involved in is going to be like World War II, where it's just there's such moral clarity to it. And I think the U.S. experience in World War II in fighting a good war has made us, sometimes deluded us into thinking that we're always a force for good in the world and that the U.S. military is always a liberator and always a force for good. But that hasn't always been the case. And so, as a Marine, whatever, willing and instant obedience to all orders, you follow what the commander-in-chief tells you to do. And you serve the country, you don't serve the mission. So even if you disagree with the mission, the service is about the institution of the military and the institution of the country. And I think that's why people continue to serve and should continue to serve. And I remember before the 13 service members got killed during the evacuation, I made a joke to another vet that these young Marines who were going to the Kabul airport were probably ecstatic because they finally get to have a deployment and they thought they were going to be in a peacetime military. Because, when you're a young Marine, you want nothing more than to deploy. And I remember I was afraid I was going to miss the war. I was 21 at the time, so that's why I had that kind of thinking. But I was afraid I was going to miss the war. But we have a responsibility not to abuse this kind of enthusiasm. I mean, when you ask a young Marine or a young soldier to jump, they say, how high? And there's a responsibility among the American public not to allow politicians to abuse that enthusiasm. And when I use the example about, well, would you want that for your own kids? I don't mean it literally, I just mean for people to put themselves in the shoes of military families who have borne the brunt of this. And for people who have lost their legs or who were killed, I think the sacrifice is for the country. And so there's always meaning to that, because if it wasn't them, it would have been someone else. And especially in a period where we have an all-volunteer army, they literally go so that others aren't forced to go. So I think there's always a heroism involved in that. It's up to us to make sure that we're not sending them into futile wars. And that's why I get upset when I hear pundits, especially pundits who aren't veterans, go on TV and say, well, we were only losing 12 people a year, it was a low cost. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that on cable news or seen it written in a major newspaper. Okay, only 12 people, but for what? If we lose 12 people for something that's achievable or for something that advances U.S. strategic interests, fine. I remember in boot camp, they told me, Marines are supposed to die for their country. It's not a tragedy when a Marine dies. But it is a tragedy if a Marine dies or any young American dies for a goal that's absolutely not achievable. So that would be my answer to that question.
Hello. So I'm deeply skeptical, but I wondered if you have any reason or have seen any signals that we should trust the Taliban in saying that they're going to be more equal with women and girls' rights.
Yeah, I don't think we should ever trust the Taliban. I think they are ideologues. They're ideologically a very rigid group. And I don't think that they've altered their views from the 90s. They've allowed girls to go to school up to 6th grade. But after 6th grade, they're not allowing girls to go to school, and they've given some sort of excuse about there not being resources and that the classrooms aren't set up. They gave that same excuse in the 90s, and they always said, once the conditions are set, we're going to let girls go to school, and they never did. And I think they're taking a page out of their old playbook and trying to do that again. The difference is that there's a bunch of literate Afghan girls who have WhatsApp and Facebook and Telegram and Twitter, and it's going to be hard for the Taliban to just let that fade away. In fact, when they made the announcement about 6th grade, which was a couple weeks ago, there was a huge international backlash. And then they adjusted their statement, and they said, well, actually, we're working to make sure girls can go to school. Now, whether that actually happens, who knows? But it does show that they're a little bit susceptible to international criticism. I mean, that's why it's so important for the United States to stay engaged diplomatically and stay engaged through aid. But I think realistically, things are going to be pretty dismal for Afghan women. There's other efforts, there's talks about putting the American University of Afghanistan in Turkey and allowing education to continue that way. Right now, this is another thing you could talk to your lawmakers about. The 2022 recipients for Fulbright scholarships from Afghanistan are currently in limbo, and it's unclear whether they're actually going to be able to get to do it. I mean, this would be such an easy lift. Why wouldn't you want to invest in the next generation of Afghan leaders, which would include women? Who knows if the Taliban will be around in 20 years? The Afghan government was only around for 20 years. But I think what's important is to keep investing in young Afghans. But yeah, the short answer is that it's going to be really dismal, I think, in the near future, and I wouldn't expect that much out of the Taliban.
I'll ask one more, and this is maybe more of a philosophical, but when we look at U.S. military presence around the world, and I appreciate your emphasis on the diplomatic, because I think that's where we should put our time, our money. But we have so many military bases. And when you think about some of the causes of 9/11, it had to do with military bases in Saudi Arabia. So many of the things that we seem to do further destabilize the world instead of stabilizing the world, and to continue to put more US military people in places where people don't want them, as we can imagine not wanting a Chinese military base here or a Russian military base. I guess I'm just asking you to reflect on how our strategy is making the world a less peaceful place and a far more dangerous place.
Yeah, I mean, you're preaching to the choir, for me at least. I do think we have too many bases. Look, there's legitimate roles for the U.S. military abroad, but I do think we have too many bases. I think the defense budget is frankly disrespectful to the U.S. taxpayer. We had $4 billion allocated for the Afghan security forces, and when they completely dissolved, there was just this assumption in Washington that, okay, well, we'll take this $4 billion and apply it to some other part of the defense budget. There's just a knee-jerk reaction that the defense budget needs to keep getting bigger. So I agree with your assessment. I mean, I think there's always going to be enemies of the United States, and to some degree, some of the terrorist organizations don't need much inspiration to want to attack the United States. So I think the presence of US troops in Saudi Arabia was a contributing factor, not the only factor, but it was a contributing factor. But I agree with you. I think there's a lot of great things about America and Americans, but we're not always the best at putting ourselves in other people's shoes. And it's funny because we'll talk about the South China Sea almost as if it's the Gulf of Mexico, or we'll talk about the Persian Gulf as if it's the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, imagine if Iranian warships were just 100 miles off of the coast of Florida, what the American public's reaction would be. And yet we just assume that other countries should feel secure about this at the same time that we're sanctioning them, at the same time that we're saying these regimes are illegitimate. So I agree. I think we're an overextended military.
Let's thank Adam for getting us started in this conversation. Thank you. Appreciate it. Wow, so much more to talk about, and I think some of you would be happy to stay longer, but we've got to help Adam out a little bit, give him some rest, but you can continue the conversation. Please do that. That's what World Affairs Council is for. We're just starting the conversation. We haven't solved anything. We're just talking amongst each other as Americans, and appreciate Adam for getting us started. We have some great programs coming up. On October 7, we'll be talking to a Saudi economic advisor, doing that virtually. October 11, the Indian Consul General from Chicago is going to come to talk about Indian-U.S. relations. And on October 19, we have our annual China Town Hall session, where we get a live stream from the U.S.-China National Committee. Fareed Zakaria from CNN is their special guest this time. We'll get to hear that conversation, but then again, we talk amongst each other about China-U.S. relations. So those three are coming up. If you want to register for them, go to worldmichigan.org. Thanks to Mark and our good friends from Aquinas for hosting us. Thanks to class and the good friends at GRCC for filming. And thank you all for coming. Have a good night.